our purpose tonight is to talk for a little bit about the question of common interests, things in common in marriage and homes. If we have time, we'll touch briefly on the question of in-laws. I'm trying to take two of the lesser topics, although personally I consider them quite major. Lesser in terms of your indicated interest earlier. Next week, albeit it's the week of prayer, we are going to proceed with the number one topic on your list, and that is how to find a marriage partner. We will take 2 weeks on it, however, and I'm sure that you will appreciate the preparation that's going into that in those 2 evenings. Now, when we talk about things in common, one of the most important things to have in common is a belief in God, the author of love and marriage, which of course is where we left off last week. And when we talk of things in common interests, this can actually invade all of the major areas of marriage success or breakdown. And so this topic, I assure you, find very significant. I'd like to pinpoint what your questions were by reading a few of them along this line. How important is it to marry someone with the same type of background as yours when growing up, in terms of money, social life, status, religious affairs? How to keep a relationship alive and find things in common. In seeking someone to spend your life with, how important is background as far as home life, as far as interests? How should such a matter be ranked with personality of the individual and how one would get along with him or her? What are ways we can find to develop more things in common? There is another category, post-marriage. What do you do if after marriage you find you have little or nothing in common? How can the differences of sleeping habits be reconciled? One likes to stay up late and doesn't like to get up in the morning. The other likes to go to bed in regular time in order to get up in the morning. It's a rather nitty-gritty. And can a marriage really be a great success with the pairing of two people whose personalities differ? Example, husband quiet, wife outgoing, or vice versa. Example 2, husband loves outdoors and plans to center his work around it, versus wife who tends to like city better and wants to be with friends all around her. Example 3, husband makes life a challenge by seeing what he doesn't need, versus wife who wants all the modern conveniences in the market. I can feel that a crisis may be in the making between my husband and I. He's just started back to college and is all caught up in classes and studying late at the library. I'm beginning to feel very left out of his new world. I've spoken to him of my feeling, but we don't quite know how to handle it. I work full-time but have evenings free. Can't afford to continue my college education. What does one do about a husband that loves to golf too much? There's a third category that brings up an entirely different question, and yet not so different after all. Is interracial marriage a good idea? Does the Bible have anything to say on this, or E.G. White? Please, a discussion on marriage of people of different faiths, discussion on interracial marriage and its inevitable problems. What is the church's stand now on racially and culturally mixed marriages, with both parties being members in good standing? Why don't most SDA families believe in interracial marriages? Remember, God is no respecter of persons. We are all sons of God. How do you know if two people are meant to be? When the Bible speaks of be ye not unequally yoked, is he speaking also of interracial marriage? Now it seems logical for this particular topic to come under things in common. Doesn't it? I hope you'll agree that this is a logical place to put it. Where would we turn if we were going to find anything in Scripture on the question of common interests, common ways, common background? Some of the books on marriage have quoted Amos, the 3rd chapter, verse 3. And it might be an example of something that we are often famous for, taking texts out of context and stretching them to fit whatever we are trying to fit. I'm not sure that it's exegetically correct to even use this text on this subject tonight. But it's quite commonly phrased and verbalized. Can two walk together except they be agreed? If you have a margin in your Bible, you'll discover that be agreed actually means or have made an appointment. And right there, that takes the soup out of our purpose of using the text in this way. It sounds like something that would apply to a college campus. Can two walk together unless they've made a date to go to the program together or something like this. And yet, it also suggests a great principle, which the wise man, Solomon, would go along with. And Jesus himself, when he said, can a house divided against itself stand? And what fellowship has Christ with Belial, or with light with darkness? Whether it's religion, or whether it's anything else. The need for common interests, common ways, common background, has certainly been demonstrated in practical life. Case history after case history. There is a description in the Bible commentary which I think is quite to the point. The more a man and woman have in common, even before marriage, the greater likelihood that they will find the companionship marriage should bring, and that the union will be a complete success. Conversely, where there are great differences in background, training, attitudes, principles, likes and dislikes, it is far more difficult to be one in mind and spirit, and thus to find success in the marriage relationship. Succinctly put, simply stating a great principle that many people have run head on into inadvertently. Some people would say that this question of having things in common, common interests, would be irrelevant and not that important. I'd like to suggest it's one of the majors in terms of the kind of homes that you talk about that are made in heaven, or whatever other label you might attach. It is just logical to conclude that the people who end up in marriage with the most common interests are going to spend the most time together. And the people who end up in marriage with the least common interests are going to spend the least time together. Does that make sense? That's the way it's going to be. And even though there are people who have a religious element in their homes and who are spiritually on the same frequency, there can still be an increased closeness and a difference when it comes to things in common. Now, this gets real sticky before people are married, because he likes football and she likes him. And she's never liked football until now. And now she's discovered a like that she didn't realize she had before. Football. And he is pleased that she likes football. I'm using an illustration from the world at large. You can substitute anything you want. And the only reason that she would even pay any attention to a football game is because she likes him. Well, after they've been married for 6 months, and she has her man, she wakes up to the realization that she always has hated football, can't stand it. And he wakes up to the realization that she hates football. And gradually they begin to discover what really the truth is. The issue when you are going together, when you're becoming acquainted, is not what do you like all of a sudden because you like me. The question is, what have you always liked and what have you always really not liked that much? It better be judged on the basis of the long haul, hadn't it? Instead of those times, just prior to marriage. Now, of course, it's a little bit ridiculous to suggest to people before they get hooked to run over to the counseling center and take tests to find out how many common interests they have and how compatible they would be personality-wise. Because who's going to do that? Well, what about these questions that have to do with people who are already married and who discover that they have very little in common? Is there something they can do about that? I believe that the counseling center, testing concerning personality, compatibilities and incompatibilities, actual interest, vocational interest tests and things like these can be real helpful. And I'm going to share just a personal experience along that line. We went off to study at the seminary in 1958 for a summer when it was Potomac University. And during that summer, we became acquainted with a psychologist who had known my parents when they were in school together at Walla Walla College. And he took an interest in my wife and I, and although we didn't know him very well, early in our brief meeting, he volunteered to give us free, which was something, a battery of tests if we were interested, because we had expressed a little interest in psychological testing. And so we sat down and took all of his tests. We took the Minnesota Multiphasic, the Taylor-Johnson Temperament. We took tests for each other, back and forth. We even took the Rorschach Inkblot test. Scared to death the whole time on the Rorschach. And the interesting thing was that with very little background and knowledge, he was able to describe to us things that we knew, at least 75% of the things we already knew about ourselves. And because of the impressive validity of the 75%, we were impressed to at least listen to the other 25% that we hadn't discovered about ourselves yet. For one thing, it turned out to be a major breakthrough in my life because I had been trying to be something that I wasn't in terms of my role in the ministry. And I discovered, instead of trying to be something you're not, that God, through this strange testing method, was leading me to realize some of the compatibilities of my personality with types of ministry, and where to go and where to look in the future. And although I had been a person who had knocked the whole idea in the past before that time, ever since that time, I've been friendly toward some of the methods that have been developed to help us understand more about what makes us tick. I think God can use them. I really do. I think that two people who are going to seriously consider living together before or after marriage can receive great benefit from seriously studying the patterns that show up on some of these and can learn how to adjust to each other better, including common interests. But suppose that two people discover they have many things that are not in common. Well, one thing they'll want to do is to sit down and decide not to major in those at least. And to have appointed times when they can pursue their own interests agreed upon by both parties. And they will do everything they can to get out of the woods into their awareness the things that they do have in common, and will major on those for the sake of being together and for the sake of their marriage. Does this make sense? We'll seriously study it and admit it and face it. Now, I'd like to put up here on the board, and someone was asking why we have the board up here anyway, last few times. Part of it is for a nice background. It makes a nice, colorful background. I'd like to put up on the board again the majors that show up, the major areas, epitomized by this character, Mr. X, and his two R's. Mr. X and his two R's represent money, a problem in marriage and family, religion, in-laws, children, things in common, and by the way, does this have to simply confine itself to hobbies and interests? Things in common can cover a lot of areas. Each of these areas here represent the major areas that marriages succeed or fail on, and represent problem areas that cause breakdowns in communication. Roles and reconciliation. If two people get married and they discover that she is neat and he is sloppy, they are going to have that not in common, aren't they? And they're going to have potential and real communication breakdowns on occasion. We often come along with this thing that they should be sure and squeeze the toothpaste on the same end of the tube, and we laugh. But, it would be something, it would really be something if the toothpaste tube was the only thing that was at stake. That's not the issue at all. There are all kinds of differences and backgrounds. And these have a tendency of really showing up, don't they? Now, let's take the question of the interracial marriage situation. If these are the 8 majors around which marriages succeed or break down, do you have any idea which of these are going to be possibly influenced by interracial marriages? What'd you say? All right, the first one I hear is in-laws. Is anything else of these 8 majors going to be influenced by interracial marriage? Children. Anything else? What? Roles? All right. Things in common? If you can identify those letters up there after this. Now I'm going to suggest maybe not money, maybe not religion, maybe not reconciliation. But when you take the 8 areas around which communication breaks down in marriage, and you have 4 of them already potential problems, then there's a 5th one that's going to become a problem too. Are you aware of that? In fact, when there are major potential problems and real problems that develop on 3 or 4 or half or more of these 8, this one always gets hit. It always gets hit. Maybe I shouldn't be too dogmatic on that. Now, whether you people all agree that these are going to be the issues could be seriously questioned. But I'd like to try and answer the question that is brought up here about interracial marriage. But first of all, the absence of anything significant per se in the Bible. Is interracial marriage a good idea? Does the Bible have anything to say on this? Or E.G. White? If there is a Bible scholar or professor here that knows something from the Bible on it that I don't, I wish you'd come up in a few moments when we open this up. I know that Moses married an Ethiopian. And I guess that's on interracial marriage. I don't know. Other than that, and perhaps a sample of something or two like that, I don't know of much in the Bible on the subject. I do know of one reference in the book Selected Messages by Ellen White. It's on page Selected Messages, volume 2, page 343 and 344. It's the only thing we know of on it. And this is essentially what she says. There is an objection to intermarriage. All should consider that they have no right to entail upon their offspring that which will place them at a disadvantage. They have no right to give them as a birthright a condition which would subject them to a life of humiliation. The children of these mixed marriages have a feeling of bitterness toward the parents who have given them this lifelong inheritance. For this reason, if there were no other, there should be no intermarriage. In reply to inquiries regarding the advisability of intermarriage between Christian young people, I will say that in my earlier experience, this question was brought before me, and the light given me of the Lord was that this step should not be taken, for it is sure to create controversy and confusion. I have always had the same counsel to give. No encouragement to marriages of this character should be given among our people. The Lord is not leading in this direction. Well, when you read something like that, the next question is why? Why? Have you noticed the one reason given so far? The one that was obvious? What was it? Children. All right? Now, in this country, and in this particular society, perhaps unlike Moses and the Ethiopian, I don't know, this kind of counsel was given. However, I don't know of anyone who has given any moral reason that God is against it. I don't know of anyone who's ever been able to find a biological reason why there's anything against it. The only reason, and the only reasons given, appear to be in the same category as reasons why other people with differing backgrounds should seriously consider whether or not to marry. So, if you will have it in your clear thinking, there is nothing racially against intermarriage any more than there is something against someone who's sloppy marrying someone who's neat. Do you follow it all? The issue is not color. The issue is common ways, common interests, common backgrounds, and what it can produce in this area in the future. And it really bothers some people to feel that we have to discuss this issue in the church in relationship to some kind of moral standard or some reason that God is against it and therefore puts people on a different level of status and what have you. God is no respecter of persons. So would it be safe to say that if a person was going to seriously question the advisability of marriage, whether it had to do with color or whether it had to do with 4 or 5 of the other dissimilarities on the major areas of marriage breakdown, the issue would be the same. I hope this makes sense to you. It's the only thing that made sense to me. And perhaps if we were in a different country, a different area, a different society, perhaps if our society actually changed that much, that it would not present a problem from either side with children, then the issue would be different. I find most people do not believe that this much of a change has taken place yet. So much for that. Now we want to take just a brief look at in-laws, and then I want to open it up, first of all, for some reaction from my associate, Dick Wynn, who promised me that he'd come up here when I called on him, if he hasn't run already. And then from others who might have some real authority or evidence on either of these topics that we have touched on briefly. Is it true that marrying someone means also marrying the whole family? What role do in-laws play? Is it absolutely necessary to get along with your boyfriend's parents, since you probably won't be seeing much of them after you're married anyway? What can you do when you and your boyfriend get along almost perfectly in every way, except that you just can't seem to like or enjoy his parents? In-laws. What do you do with parents who have a great deal of psychological dependence on you? How do you break ties lovingly? How do you break ties lovingly? Especially mother-daughter relationships. They do approve of marriage, but reality hits them too hard. How do you get rid of an in-law who lives with you, causes problems, but won't leave even when requested to do so? That is, he won't leave without your having to use physical or legal force. Is it advisable to have in-laws, husbands or wives, stay with us? My wife and I are just newlyweds. During our courtship and engagement, my mother made subtle and sometimes not so subtle insinuations that she didn't want her youngest son to leave home. My mom has been divorced and has not remarried. My only brother is married and lives in Southern California. Now that we are married and are living in the same community with both my mother and my wife's family, how will we prevent the possible friction of in-laws? How often should we accept meal invitations? How often should we visit our families in their homes or they in ours? How do we handle the animosity my mom may show toward my wife for stealing me away from her? How can one break icy hatred with one's in-laws or in-laws to be? You know, there's very definite scripture on this subject. Genesis 2:24 and 25. And of course, it's quoted again in Matthew the 19th chapter. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Leave father and mother. That's the prediction made by God when marriage was first born. And that's the rule of thumb. Is it not? That's the rule of thumb. You leave father and mother. Well, how? You leave them psychologically. You leave them emotionally. You are no longer dependent upon them. You're no longer dependent upon them in any way. You don't borrow money from them. You don't borrow money from them. You don't live on their income. And contrary to basic youth conflicts, you move away from them. Especially in the first few years of marriage. If you have potential in-law problems, you move to New York. If you're going to be living with them later, in their aging years, then by that time you've plowed your own furrow. But marriage is for grown-ups. It is for people who have clipped the umbilical cord psychologically, emotionally, financially. They are no longer dependent upon father and mother. Is that going too far? And you'd be surprised how many people have had serious marriage problems because they didn't follow the rule of the Bible. Leave father and mother and cleave unto your mate. Now, if it's possible to leave them, as my associate was telling me just a few minutes ago, if it's possible to leave them emotionally and psychologically, then perhaps you could live next door to them in the same town to begin with. But it simply isn't the rule of thumb. And it's really interesting how people who are ill, emotionally ill, will sometimes feed on their children, or their children feed on their parents, and cause serious marriage problems. I remember a man one time whose mother took seriously ill, became an invalid. After all the children had left except him. And of course he had to stay and take care of his poor invalid mother. For years he did. He was in his 40s, close to 50. Still at home, cooking for mother, taking care of his poor invalid mother. At first glance, and mostly all the glances, you would expect her to be, she appeared to be one of the most pious women in the church. But always under the weather, having to stay in bed, bedridden, couldn't get out of bed, couldn't walk, had to have things brought to her. Until one night one of our elders went to see him and he was gone. She was across the room foraging in the closet. The shade was up a couple inches and he happened to see her run across the room and back into bed when she heard the doorbell ring. A man had come to town several years before by the name of Meade McGuire, who was known to have some real significant answers to prayer for the sick. Someone told her about him, and he was willing to come and pray for her, and she would have none of it. Not on your life. This was her method of keeping her boy at home. What do you do? Does the Bible principle still apply? Certainly does, doesn't it? Leave father and mother. Cleave unto your companion. We discovered that if he had done that years before, she wouldn't have been able to play the game any longer. Because that's the way it finally happened. Well, that's the principle on that. I like to have some reaction Please, those who have something definite to say that has come up, you feel led by the Holy Spirit, you have some scripture, you have some correction, you have something to add, you have something to react to, speak up. We'd like to hear what you have to say. First of all, I'd like to ask Elder Wynn to come down and give us a brief reaction to what he thinks has been said so far and add something to it or whatever. And then please go ahead and stay by the microphone. And if we have some others that want to come over here, let's go ahead and know who you are.
The one thought that came to my mind as you were considering these factors is the relevance of this whole matter of age readiness. I can remember on several occasions young people coming into my office at the delightful age of 16, 17, and 18 and saying, "I love him, I want to marry him, we have so much in common." And I asked them, "Well, what do you really have in common?" "Well, we both like horses and chocolate ice cream." And it seems that one thing that happens as people become more mature is that the things that they would have in common become more basic. For example, when a person matures a bit, to the age of the early 20s or so, then they're likely to come in and say, "We have so much in common, we both want to give our lives to be foreign missionaries." And this is a much more fundamental thing in common. And it's easy for a young person to delude themselves, to think they have a lot in common when things they have in common are utterly irrelevant. I remember when my wife and I were first engaged, and we were 23 at that point. Even at that time, we remember walking down the street, window shopping, contemplating what we were going to buy for our home that we were going to be setting up, and being kind of excited about the fact that we both liked modern furniture, and we thought this was a really important discovery. The Lord had matched us up in that area. Well, looking back, we've discovered not only that our tastes in furniture have changed as we've spent time together, but it's almost an irrelevant point, you know. So what if we now like country French? It has very little to do with the real business of a marriage. Also, one other thing, and I'll step away. We found in many, many cases, again on the matter of age readiness, there seems to be a time in many young persons' lives, particularly those who've grown up Adventist, a time maybe in the late teens, early 20s, when it's almost stylish or almost expected to go through a short or even long era of holding the Adventist Church off at arm's length, of a certain period of dissatisfaction with Adventism. And what so often happens is that in this era, perhaps brought on by the fact that they're acquainted with Adventism but not with Christ, during this era, these persons form marriage alliances. And then it happens so many times, it's almost pathetic. Shortly thereafter, maybe a year or two after marriage, one or the other falls hopelessly in love with Jesus Christ. And all of a sudden, Adventism in all of its complex beauty jumps back into relevance in their life, and they're deeply committed to living it in its fullness. And as you know, Adventism has something to say about every detail of life. Then what happens? You've got a huge rift right in the middle of marriage. Because all of a sudden to one of the partners, paying tithe, eating the proper foods, banning certain TV programs, sending the kids to church school, and all these things suddenly mean a great deal to them. And to the other member of the marriage, it means nothing. And thinking that they had something in common a few years before in their period of rebellion, they now discover that they no longer do. And all of a sudden, Ellen White's counsel about making marriage decisions a little bit later in life seems to have a lot of relevance. Maybe that's stealing the thunder from the next 2 weeks, but I think it's very timely.
Thank you very much. That reminds me of a text that certainly brings in-laws and things in common, Matthew 10, 34, and 35. And please get back to the microphone over here, whoever you were. Matthew 10, 34 and 35. Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword. For I am come to set a man at variance against his father, and the daughter against her mother, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's foes shall be they of his own household. You study the context of that passage, and you find that Jesus is the great cleaver. Isn't that true? And the religious issues and lack of common interest in religious things and spiritual things has often become a real sword, just as Elder Wynn was suggesting here in a marriage. All right, ladies first, over here, please.
I don't think that the question, well, it hasn't been answered satisfactorily to me. What you do with in-laws that are poisonous to you, or what you do with a mother-in-law that, constantly comes over to your house and says nasty things about you to her son and, tears you apart. And I know you can move away, but I think that it can still happen. And what do you do about that? What can be done? And especially what can be done for those of us who aren't married and we want to avoid a problem such as this. And sometimes you can't avoid it, You're in love with somebody and the necessary things fit, but, his father hates you. What can be done?
Obviously, there's going to be an attempted period of negotiation, right? Everybody's going to try. The point is that when negotiation has not worked, then when the question of geographical distance begins to make sense. And I don't know. I'm really a believer in the geographical distance. If you haven't picked that up yet, I'll run it by again. And you say, well, maybe we can't. Our job, our work, our home. Well, maybe you'd better. Maybe you'd better, regardless of whether you can or not. Now, someone might say, well, why don't we go back to the old Bible principle of everyone living practically in the same tent? If you're going to go back to the patriarchal age, then don't forget to take the whole thing, lock, stock, and barrel. Don't take just part of it. So if anyone's going to argue patriarchal age, including basic youth conflicts, then you let your father send his hired man to pick out your wife for you. And all the rest of it. And let's be consistent. Let's not just take one part out of it. Okay, over here.
You may have answered my question in your talk, and I hope I wasn't in a different thought train when you did. But when you first came here, you took us through a series on worship and your personal relationship with God. And then, for a while, you talked about some things that just thrilled me about the Holy Spirit and you showed us texts in study group in different places and in your sermons about you'll know to turn at the right hand or the left hand, and that the prayer life wasn't optional to the victorious Christian life, and that Christ had no power that we couldn't have if we'd rely on His Father like He did. And then tonight, you said something that seemed really out of context when you seemed to lead us to put so much faith in testing and things that man has devised to understand himself. And I just, like I say, I hope I wasn't asleep, but it seemed like instead of directing us to a source that could help every single person with no mistakes, you seemed to put your influence to a source that would be good for some people, but for others would be altogether wrong. And I was just wondering why it was that you've made this radical shift on this one point.
Apostasy. I think that if we were to spend one quarter talking about health reform, we could probably have the same kind of question, right? In other words, is there ever a time when it makes sense to talk about something besides righteousness by faith, even though some of us are fanatics on that? And I buy your suggestion. Personally, I buy your suggestion that if we will seek the Lord and be converted every day, all our problems are going to be solved. But God does not operate in a vacuum, and He will often use information and study along different lines to help us see our need of Him. And I do not believe in relying totally upon some kind of psychological testing, but I have had evidence in my own life that God can use something like that on occasion. And if I'm asleep at the switch, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Do you have something else you'd like to add?
I basically agree. I just, like you didn't even allude to the fact that you should rely partially on, well, I mean, I realize in the whole context of things, you probably meant to imply it, but I just didn't see the reminder tonight that we could also use prayer as opposed to just the testing. I mean, I see your point though.
Thank you. Your point is well taken, and let's not ignore that point. But we have the same thing probably evidenced in Testimonies, Volume 1 to 9, where you have a great deal of emphasis upon do's and don'ts, rebukes and reproofs of sin, and where the author is repeatedly relying upon the information she's already dispensed in books like Steps to Christ and Desire of Ages, and is dealing with other issues at the same time. But really, I can hardly wait for this quarter to be over. Yes, back here.
Going back to the subject of interracial marriage, I have a very intimate acquaintance, a very good friend of mine, who felt that he could go ahead and enter into an interracial marriage if he could get rid of the objections. So they decided not to have any children. Well, as that decision usually works out, it almost never works out. The children somehow come, whether you choose to have them or not. Not always.
Would it be possible for two people to decide before they're married they're not going to have any children?
Yes, in some cases.
And one of them change their mind after they're married for a few years? Has this ever happened?
Very true.
And it begins to be a galling yoke?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Now, his wife is quite pregnant. And the problems of in-laws and society are beginning to loom very largely in their minds. It's having a rather hard effect on their marriage. The counsel of the Lord seemed very plain, and of course they figured they could somehow find a way around it. It doesn't seem to have worked. And of course the decision, now I'm not saying this is always not a good thing to do. I think there are times, sometimes with some people, when it is a wise decision to choose not to have children. But generally speaking, this is denying love its opportunity to manifest itself in the marriage relationship, much like the Trinity. This is an opportunity to create a love object, just as the Trinity created man. Why? To love him. And this is something in marriage, and denying this opportunity creates another hardship also, I think, another area of possible stress.
Thank you. Yes?
I'm just curious. Have you attended the Basic Youth Seminar?
Yes, sir.
Why did you draw that from what he said, that they should not leave the house of the parents? Or is that what you said?
Probably I was exaggerating. There is a great deal of the patriarchal flavor in his presentation, I think, which would lead some of us to exaggerate it in bringing it back by later.
So it was an exaggeration?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, sir?
Yeah, I'd like to bring up the story of Abraham in Genesis 12. And it speaks of the Lord coming to Abraham, or Abram at that time, when he was 72 or 74 years old, and telling him to get out of his own country so that he could make of him a great nation, to get away from his kindred. And it kind of, one tie that's kind of hard to break, I do believe, with a home is the spiritual tie between your parents and yourself. Because to you, your first impression of God is your parents. And if they have anything, that defects that you notice, it might make it kind of hard being around them to have a rich, full spiritual life on your own. And so that's another important thing about the distance between you and your parents.
Thank you. Really, we could pick up a lot of good insight from our own personal background and experience. And I think that this is where some of your observations, no doubt, are coming from. I'd like to make one more corrective statement about basic youth conflicts. I personally have built up a head of steam for this reason. There are so many of my compatriots that have gone so headlong into that they take everything that comes out of that, hook, line, and sinker, and ask no questions about any part of it. Now that is why I have a head of steam about it. And if you've detected that head of steam, I think you've probably read right. We ought to stop taking everything that's given to us and hammer out our own study. And don't simply grab something and hold it to your chest because 18,000 people are going, even though they're taking their Bibles. Don't take it hook, line, and sinker. Study it out for yourself. And that is the basic thing you're sensing here. There's a lot of good there. I think there are some serious errors. And you better sift and choose, pick and choose. I'd like to conclude with Insight Magazine. Ready? From the honor of your presence, the girl who had been preparing for a wedding instead of a marriage. Did you read it? And so, my dear cousin, you have a handsome fiancé, a beautiful wedding plan, plenty of gifts, and a cozy honeymoon trip. But in a few short weeks, you'll really begin to know about marriage. It will boil down to bills, homework, dirty laundry, repeat menus, and surprises. You'll each be learning things about the other that never surfaced before. And don't be amazed to find out that truly converted Christians can have problems in their marriages too. Remember, you're no longer playing house. It's the real thing. And then here's the point on tonight's topic. Serious faults may appear in your loved one's character or just small incompatibilities, but you cannot change them. Better to resolve that they will always be that way and ask God for more grace to live with them. I think that's heavy. That's good. A number of bad marriage problems that my wife and I have come across in talking with other people have been based on the early marriage intent of one partner or the other to completely change and transform their partner. No, sir. You better accept them the way they are. And ask God for the grace to live with them if they squeeze the toothpaste on the other end than you do. Yes, one more over here and one over here, all right?
For people who are interested on the question of interracial marriage, the book, The Southern Work, has quite a bit to say about it.
The which?
The Southern Work by Mrs. White. It's a historic compilation.
Okay.
And I think probably that quote that you read came out of this same era in which the whole historical background was the Civil War and people going down, working with the blacks in the South, and some of them feeling that it would be very beneficial for the work if they would intermarry and show that there was no barrier in Christ. And I think this needs to be considered where Mrs. White was saying, don't do things like this. And that throughout the Bible, nothing was said on interracial marriages. In fact, Miriam was reproved for being upset about Moses' marriage. And I really didn't like the tone that came across that these people had violated the counsel of God, almost like they had committed a sin. I don't think this is a sin. I think times have changed in the United States in certain places. Yes, people are still very prejudiced about these things. But when it really boils down to it on interracial marriages, most people who object to it are doing so because they're prejudiced, because they're racist. And I don't think most people are objecting to it because of the children. I worked in the inner city for 15 months, and of all the kids I knew there that were of mixed marriages, only one or two were upset about the fact that they were of mixed ancestry, and most of them thought it was the greatest thing that had ever happened because they could date blacks, they could date whites, they could date Mexicans. They thought it was great. Maybe in some ways I think our Adventist society is behind much of the world, especially some of the more secular world. And I think that's one thing we could learn a lot from maybe some of the secularists and quit looking at all the die-hard Southern Orthodox.
He suggests a principle that is well to remember. When you study the writings of what we call the spirit of prophecy, you better not take the specifics, you better look for the principle involved. The specifics will often not be applicable today, such as bicycle, tennis, so on. But the principle will be universal. And I think if you do that with this statement we read, you'd find something that would essentially say what he's saying there. Yes?
I'd just like to say that I really think that because, when there is an interracial marriage, I think that it's really the parents' responsibility to treat the children like they are normal children and not like they're some special group. I'm sure that, I know myself that society does give a little bit of a hassle. But the way I was brought up that everybody is just the same and that, everybody's going to be different and that's why I'm different too. And I really think that, that the way I was brought up and that how I was brought up in Jesus, that He loves us all regardless of what we are. And I think that it's the way the parents' attitude toward their children are, whether they're going to be. Because if a rich lady marries a real poor guy or something, they're going to have problems there too. And their kids might suffer from that even though they're the same race. Whereas if they're black and white and the parents just say, okay, we're going to have children and they're going to be different. And we shouldn't treat them like they're going to be different. But, we shouldn't drill into their heads that, I don't know, I think I have a real advantage. I really do, because I think that, I can relate to everybody. It's not like I'm never going to be prejudiced. I can't. There's no way I can. So, I'm just all mixed up, and I really think that's neat. And I can remember one time in Sabbath school we were talking about what our God was like. And all the white kids had a grandpa on a throne, and the black kids all had an afro with a motorcycle, and it was really neat. But mine was just like me. He was just like me, and it was really different that I had a God like that. But I think it's really important that it's the parents' attitude toward the children and what they bring their children up as is going to make the difference, not necessarily what society is going to do, because the parents make the children more than society will.
That's beautiful. Anyone want to argue with her? That we needed to hear from you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay, I know not why God's wondrous grace. Shall we stand as we sing this song? I know not why God's wondrous grace to me He hath made known, nor why unworthy Christ in love redeemed me for His own.
You have been listening to another special American Christian Ministries presentation. International copyright, all rights reserved. To order a copy of this or other presentations, or for a free catalog, please call toll-free 800-233-4450. International calls dial 717-652-7000. You may also order from our secure website at www.americanchristianministry.org. There you will discover the largest selection of authentic Adventist preaching available. You can trust ACM. There's no compromise here. If American Christian Ministries has been a blessing to you, why not take a moment just now and send us a note or an email with your testimony? We'll share it with the speakers and volunteer workers to encourage you. Your prayers and continued financial support are very important to ensure the continuation of this ministry as we help prepare America and the world to meet Jesus Christ. He is coming soon.